Welcome to everybody out here in our audience today. We're happy you're able to join us on today's topic about ESG. This was the first educational meeting Senator Crapo and I have hosted together on ESG. Interestingly, though, last autumn, we had some other banking issue meetings that we did a roundtable on, but we welcome you here today. We also have some ESG experts that are going to join us. If you'll see on the screen, we have Vivek Ramaswamy. He is an expert nationally on what's happening in the world of ESG. We also have the Utah State Treasurer, who's sitting right to my left, Marlo Oaks. I've had the opportunity to serve with him in the State Treasurers Foundation. And on the screen is Derek Kreifels joining us. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the State Financial Officers Foundation. And then we have our two leading co-chairs. Senator Vic is the Senate co-chair, and Representative Sage Dixon is the House co-chair of the Federalism Committee, which is the committee that we've often taken our issues to when it comes to banking. And so, without further ado, we will get started. And I see that you're there, Vivek. Vivek is an amazing.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna read some things first to embarrass you. But you need to know, Vivek is a first-generation American entrepreneur. He's an investor, and he's from Southwest Ohio. And in 2022, he co-founded Strive, which is an Ohio-based asset management firm. The mission of this firm is based on excellence over politics, and that's really the difference of the firm. Prior to Strive, Vivek founded a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, including Roivant Sciences. He was the CEO of that for many years. He's also earned a degree from Harvard and a law degree from Yale. Vivek is a very talented human being, and I'll let him tell you about some recent experiences he's had with ESG. And if you'll go ahead, Vivek.
Thank you, Treasurer Ellsworth, and it's an honor to be with all of you. Actually, very much wanted to be there in person, but travel schedules and commitments didn't permit it today. That being said, I know we only have 10 minutes, and what to kick this off. And what I'd like to do is to presume some level of familiarity in the audience with this issue, or else you wouldn't be here. But to be able to scratch the surface a little more deeply on 6 points that I'll leave you with to kick off this discussion today, each of which could be an hour discussion unto themselves. But I'll leave you with, I think, a couple of points that I hope ground the discussion that we're about to have. And I do think we're having a discussion about one of the most important cultural and economic topics of our moment, one that very few policymakers, in my opinion, understand well, but one that I'm also gratified to see a great degree of interest and curiosity arising amongst policymakers across the country. And so kudos and thank you to this group for taking an interest in this important topic. So the first thing I'm going to do is just draw a distinction between the sustainable or socially responsible investing movement, known as SRI, and the ESG movement. I think this is a table stakes point for the conversation itself, for us to be able to understand what it is we're talking about in the first place. So years ago, for example, when I was a student at Harvard, the Harvard Endowment led a movement that was called the Socially Responsible Investing Movement that involved using investment power to divest from certain classes of assets as a way of shaping social and political behavior, to vary the costs of capital that different companies may or may not be able to issue shares based on, to be able to use that as a stick to drive underlying behavior towards more virtuous industries over more sinful ones. Tobacco stocks, arms manufacturers, oil companies might be examples of sin stocks that were the subjects of divestment. This is what the socially responsible investment movement was all about. I bring that up because I view that distinctly from the modern ESG movement, where what the modern ESG movement, the environmental, social, and governance standards that govern our capital markets and large asset allocators who participate in our capital markets, what this movement does is something different. In addition to either investing or divesting from particular securities based on the social and environmental and governance agendas at work, this goes further. It's not just about allocating capital to companies and controlling the capital allocation systems of asset managers. It is also about affecting and impacting the decisions made by the underlying companies themselves. It is about impacting the capital allocation decisions made not just amongst different firms in our markets, but within each of those firms as well, by using voting power and advocacy power as a shareholder to do it. And I just think it's one of the points that I've observed in some of the discussions across states in the country, conflating those two phenomena. The ESG movement and the problems it raises, to the extent you view it as a problem, are not simply based on certain asset managers divesting from certain sectors. The problem, in some sense, actually starts with ESG-linked asset managers being invested in certain sectors and changing the purposes of the underlying companies in those sectors. So that's just a table stakes point for grounding this conversation. The next point I'll make is that I don't call myself an ESG critic. And the reason I don't call myself an ESG critic is that in order to criticize something, you have to first be able to define it. And the definition of ESG itself is impossibly vague, okay? How you solve the E prong, environmental issues, is itself an inquiry unto itself of social and political and normative questions that have to ask whether or not you care about the human impact on the environment or whether you care foremost on the changing conditions of the environment upon human beings. To be clear, those two questions would have you measuring very different phenomena. Carbon emissions in the first case, climate-related disaster death rates of human beings in the other. That's underlying just the E prong. The S prong, how do you fight systemic racism? Is it through quota systems or is it through some other means? These are incredibly complicated issues. The G issue, under what conditions do you want the chairman of a board and a CEO to occupy the same seat versus to have those separated? These are incredibly complicated questions that are not only complicated in and of their own right, but the mystery of the ESG movement is it commits you to having one view on the E issues. But if you have that view, you are also committed to having the same view on the S issues. And if you have both of those views, you're also committed to having the same view on the third issue of whether the CEO and the chairman should be the same person based on your views on whether or not racial quota systems are appropriate in a boardroom, which are in turn tied to your perspectives on how and whether to fight climate change as a company. And the thing I'll point out is you see that mystery arise time and again with the relative synchronicity of the ESG movement in determining what the right answers are to new questions as they arise. I'll give you one example. Earlier this year, and for most of the last 5 years, the weapons manufacturing sector was viewed unfavorably by the ESG movement. Yet a group of European market leaders got together earlier this year to move the decision and the ball towards actually recharacterizing certain weapons manufacturers as pro-ESG or ESG friendly if they were also involved in shipping weapons to Ukraine. Another example, and it's a prediction that I'll offer to this group, today, nuclear energy is viewed unfavorably by the ESG movement, but I predict in the next 4 years that's actually going to change. Possibly in the next 24 months, that's going to change to be viewed more favorably by the ESG-linked movement, in part due to increasing lobbying and other forces by the nuclear energy industry, including not just political lobbying, but lobbying even with the large asset managers who determine the answers to these questions. In a certain sense, this bluff was called by Elon Musk recently in recent weeks when Tesla was excluded from a prominent ESG index, while ExxonMobil, which was the subject of a proxy battle led by BlackRock last year, was included. And so I think that's the second point I would leave you with, is that it's hard to criticize ESG when you can't define what ESG is, which leads me to the third point I'd like to make, which is that the vagueness in the definition of what counts as ESG is not actually a bug. It is a feature for the people who created the movement. What do I mean by that? The power to define what does and does not count as ESG is a source of market power in the current market environment, where a small group of asset managers, particularly the three largest asset managers in the United States, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, who together manage over $20 trillion, that is more than the GDP of the United States, those three firms are leading the way in defining not only whether or not ESG should be at the forefront of investment philosophies and shareholder advocacy, but even what counts as ESG-linked behavior. Those are effectively the three firms that define it, and other organizations from Moody's to S&P take their cues from, as I described in my book, the golden rule, which proclaims that he who has the gold makes the rules, not the golden rule that many of you know. That's actually the rule by which our current market system and the definitions of ESG work as well. They who have the gold, the 20 trillion, are leading the way in guiding the future direction of what counts as ESG friendly, let alone imposing those ESG mandates on the underlying companies they invest in. And to wrap up that third point, the thing I would observe is that I believe this is the single largest fiduciary breach of the 21st century, where what you have today is those three managers of capital of $20 trillion managing the funds of everyday citizens in this country, constituents of many of your states, whose capital is being used to advance social and political agendas in corporate America's boardrooms that most of those citizens actually disapprove of. And when you use a client's money or a constituent's money to advance an agenda that that constituent or client disapproves of, that is a textbook case of a fiduciary breach. But it's not happening on a small scale. It's happening on a $20 trillion scale, which leads me to the fourth point that I'll leave you with. This has also now reached a scale of a problem that now borders on creating an anti-competitive issue in our markets. And the anti-competitive issue is best demonstrated by a thought experiment. And I will share a thought experiment with you. And by the end of the thought experiment, you'll recognize that it's actually a description of present reality. But the thought experiment is this. If you had the CEOs of, say, companies like Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Shell, and BP in a room, and together decided to slash gas production and gas prices spike at the pump for consumers as a result, that would be a cut and dry price fixing violation. It would be the stuff of movies. There might be handcuffs. This is a cut and dry criminal antitrust violation. But somehow, when the owners of those firms, of those allegedly competing firms, happen to be the same three firms who force those companies to do the exact same thing, today that gets celebrated as ESG instead. And I think that is not only a fiduciary breach because they're using other people's money to do it, but it's happening at such a scale that it also borders on creating possibly the largest anti-competitive concern of our era as well, because it's not just limited to the oil and gas sector. You see the same thing with respect to the top owners of every sector, Microsoft and Apple, Disney and Paramount Pictures, and then, of course, Exxon and Chevron are owned in large part and controlled by the top three shareholders who cast decisive voting power in those companies. That brings me to the fifth of the 6 points I'd like to make, which is that this is the counterintuitive part to wake up to, in my opinion. This state of affairs is actually the product of the shareholder primacy dogmas that we inherited from the 20th century. And this is really important to understand because a lot of people miss this. So in the 20th century, the problem that corporate law tried to solve was the separation of ownership and control. The CEO controlled the firm, but the shareholders owned the firm. And the divergence between their interests created a principal-agent conflict. The private equity industry was born on fixing that problem. The activist hedge fund industry was born on fixing that problem. Corporate law, in the wake of post-Friedmanite, late 20th century corporate law, fiduciary canon from CEO to shareholder, was born on fixing that problem. The problem, however, in the 21st century is different, and so many miss this. It is not the fiduciary link between the CEO and the shareholder. It is not the separation of ownership and control. The problem today is the separation of ownership from ownership, where the people who claim to be the shareholder, who say that the shareholder primacy doctrines of the 20th century say you, the firm, the CEO, owe a duty to us, the shareholder, because we're the boss. The people who occupy that seat today are not the actual owners of capital. And though the private equity industry and the activist hedge fund industry and corporate law stepped up in the 1980s to address the canonical separation of ownership and control, many in our policy debates use that outdated lexicon and vocabulary to describe a uniquely 21st century problem that is different and that no one to date has actually taken on head on, which is, it's not my expression, it's that of Leo Strine, a former Delaware Chancery Court judge, the separation of ownership and ownership. That is the problem that actually the modern ESG movement presents. And I will then leave you with my final point. And while I have an op-ed running in co-authored op-ed in tomorrow's or the day after's Wall Street Journal on this topic, I'll preview it for you in this room today. Shareholder voting fixes will not solve this problem. Shareholder voting fixes are necessary. They may move the ball forward incrementally, but they will not solve the problem. And the reason I say that is that most decisions most corporate decisions are not backstopped by a shareholder vote. In fact, most of the corporate influence exerted by ESG-linked asset managers is through soft power in virtue of being the large shareholders of companies themselves. And I won't preview for you the details of the empirical data in the Wall Street Journal piece that you'll see in the coming days, but the short answer is Larry Fink's annual letter to America's CEOs has a greater impact palpably on the behavior of those companies, more so than the votes that BlackRock actually casts. Not to mention that everyday citizens can't actually cast thousands of ballots for the thousands of proposals underlying the companies in their index funds every spring. Put the practical issue to one side. The real issue is that the muscle is exercised not through hard power or through the vote principally, but through soft power in the boardroom, which means there is exactly one answer to this question. If it's an anti-competitive problem that relates to the capital of everyday citizens, it is making sure that there is a competitive marketplace in the marketplace of ideas that serves those citizens. That is why I recently left my prior path as not only an entrepreneur in biotech, but an author thereafter to found Strive Asset Management. But I hope more competitors enter the marketplace offering more diverse voices as well, and that state treasurers and other state actors who are not regulators but market participants recognize that market action is going to be, in my opinion, the ultimate solution to a problem that originated in the market. With that, thank you, Treasurer Ellsworth, for the opportunity, and I look forward to participating in the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Vivek. We appreciate it. He has had a large impact on us, and the book that I recommend that you read is Woke Inc. This is written by Vivek, and it's one that you read and then you read again. I see that we have Senator Crapo back with us, and I want to introduce our senator. It is really a pleasure to co-host this meeting with you today. Senator Crapo, you've been a lifelong Idahoan, and you have that common sense approach and he's always collaborative and creative in his approach to addressing problems in Idaho, and I appreciate that so much. Senator Crapo is a Senate Finance Committee leader and also the Senate Committee on Banking leader. So he strongly supports market policies. We worked recently as state treasurers with Senator Crapo on the IRS snooping bill and had some success with that. And we just view you as a vocal opponent to the use of ESG and are very grateful you're here today to co-host this with me. And I will yield the time to you, Senator Crapo. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Julie, and to your staff and for everyone for being involved today, and Julie, particularly for you hosting and coming up with this idea for this important roundtable discussion. Julie and her team have brought together an impressive panel who can speak to the concern about efforts to use environmental, social, and governance political choices to determine lending and investing, and as Vivek has so well stated, management options. I agree with the outline that Vivek has just put forward as to what this issue really is. I'll talk a little bit more focused on that initial decision of the allocation of capital, but it goes far beyond that, as we have just heard. The use of these criteria may seem innocuous on its surface, but unfortunately, many standards are subjective and grant regulators and corporations undue influence on public policy. Rather than going to state legislatures and Congress to debate and pass laws and policies, there's an effort to bypass voters and pressure financial institutions to reduce lending to disfavored companies or states. Credit decisions should be based on strong underwriting standards that promote economic growth and opportunities for the entire country. This is why states like Idaho and Utah have objected to the use of ESG criteria in state credit ratings. As Idaho State Treasurer Ellsworth has said, credit rating agencies should focus on Idaho's sound financial management, not evaluating political priorities. I've long pushed back against efforts to politicize financial decisions and create bad lists of legal American companies. Sadly, we're seeing more of this at this time at the federal level, and we're seeing it in their boardrooms as well as in allocation of capital. For example, look at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC's mission is to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. The SEC plays a critical role in ensuring our nation has capital markets that the public can have confidence and trust in. It provides information to investors, so as Americans prepare for their futures, they not only have a wide array of financial opportunities, but they also have the information necessary to make informed investment decisions. The SEC's primary focus should be shoring up the strength and stability of U.S. capital markets. Instead, the SEC is focused on expanding the use of ESG criteria. In March, under the direction of Chairman Gensler, the SEC issued a proposed rule on climate-related disclosures, which would require publicly traded companies to disclose information related to climate change, such as their greenhouse emissions. Sounds innocuous. However, the SEC already requires these companies to disclose material information. And various companies disclose climate-related information because it is material to their business. Telling all publicly traded companies this information is material, regardless of whether such a determination has been made, weakens the current disclosure system. Perhaps more concerning is Chairman Gensler sidestepping the legislative branch and undermining our constitutional system of checks and balances. Because the Democrats in Congress have been unable to enact radical climate policy through legislation, unelected bureaucrats in this administration are now implementing their preferred agenda through regulation. Additional disclosure requirements will only increase costs and administrative burdens for companies and discourage them from going public in the first place. The federal government should foster innovation and economic growth, not stifle it. In response to the SEC's proposed rule on climate-related disclosure, I joined my Republican colleagues on the Senate Banking and Senate Environment and Public Works committees in opposing the proposal. Unfortunately, I expect we will be fighting against burdensome duplicative regulations and executive overreach for a number of years. This administration has not been subtle in attempting to advance its radical climate and financial agenda. Some of its nominees, tasked with oversight of the economy and financial services industries, have been so radical that they have received bipartisan opposition. A few examples. Sarah Bloom Raskin, nominated to serve as the vice chair for supervision at the Federal Reserve. And Ansole Omarova, nominated to serve as comptroller of the currency. Both failed to advance in the U.S. Senate due to bipartisan objection to their radical policy positions. Ms. Raskin received her criticism for advocating that regulators act to counter climate change risk and called for the Fed to pressure financial institutions to choke off, those are her words, to choke off credit to traditional energy companies. And Ms. Omarova proposed allowing the government to block credit to industries that she deemed socially suboptimal. Again, her words, socially suboptimal. Although the nominees have withdrawn, the dangers of these ideas are pervasive, and ESG standards could provide the perfect means for achieving these misguided goals. Remember, the idea of controlling allocation of capital is not a new concept. Under the Obama administration's program called Operation Choke Point, again, their words, federal agencies created and relied upon a list of politically disfavored merchant categories, and it was a long list, such as the firearm and ammunition industry, with the intent of choking off these merchants' access to payment systems and banking services. This practice was deeply concerning because law-abiding businesses were targeted strictly for operating in an industry that some in government disfavored. As the former chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, I spent several years fighting against Operation Choke Point to ensure that all legal industries have proper access to banks and payment services. And as Vivek would probably say, now the very banks and payment services that we protected from Operation Choke Point are being forced with the same kinds of pressures from those who own their stock. We should all be concerned if unelected bureaucrats are allowed to dictate social policy through limiting access to credit. U.S. capital markets are the envy of the world and should facilitate investment and spur economic growth benefiting the entire country. Imposing subjective standards to choke off capital to disfavored industries is a disservice to businesses, employees, and investors. Unelected bureaucrats should not weaponize our financial system in this way. America is better and Americans deserve better. And we will continue to closely monitor and push back against these and similar efforts here in Washington. I want to thank you again, Treasurer Ellsworth. This is a wonderful opportunity to discuss ESG standards. And thank you to the many institutions across the state, including our community banks and credit unions that work hard to support local lending and meet the needs of Idahoans. And I look forward to continuing to support Idaho's leadership on this important issue. Thank you again very much. I'm glad to be a part of this roundtable.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. It is quite encouraging to, whenever I've had a concern about ESG or other issues with banking, to have Senator Crapo's ear and he understands some of those issues that are so critical to my constituency. I would like to introduce Derek Kreifels. He's our next guest. Derek is the co-founder and chief executive officer of the State Financial Officers Foundation. And this is a nonprofit organization in the United States. He can tell us a little bit more about that, but it's a network of state treasurers, which is where Treasurer Oaks, to my left, and I have been working through this foundation. Before he was a co-founding of SFOF, he was the chief financial assistant state treasurer of Kansas. And so you had lots of hands-on treasury experience. And Derek attended Kansas State University. And what's the most important thing you said? He is a diehard Kansas Chief fan, enjoys excellent Kansas City barbecue, and loves spending time with his family. So I'll turn the time over to you, Derek, if you could take it.
Great. Well, thank you, Treasurer Ellsworth. It is an honor to be here, and thank you for all of you that took the time to come hear more about this important topic. The State Financial Officers Foundation has a proud history with Idaho. I believe that your former state treasurer, Ron Crane, is in the room. He continues to be on our board of directors, so we have a rich history with him. And Senator Crapo, I can't thank you enough for all the work that you've done in the United States Senate, advancing economic freedom issues from your chair. You've been just a valuable resource of information and ally. I would be remiss if I wouldn't point out that you and Vivek were two of our recipients of our prestigious SFOF Honors Economic Freedom Award recipients this last winter in 2022. So congratulations again to both of you. It's always fun to follow two dynamic speakers like that. And I don't speak from a script, I like to speak from the heart. So I just want to communicate a couple things. I would say, first, we represent 27 state officials from 23 states. And together, these state elected officials, they are fighters and they are willing to stand up for what is right. When we first started SFOF, we asked a simple polling question in 14 different states. And we asked, who do you trust more on fiscal matters in your state? And we gave them the choice between their state treasurer, their governor, and their member of Congress. And the lowest that a state treasurer got in any state was 60%. The governor, depending upon his or her popularity, received 20 to 25%. And members of Congress, I'm sorry to say, usually less than 10%, regardless of political party. And so we realized that these state treasurers and state auditors, they had an enormous amount of untapped political capital. And so we knew that the right thing to do would be to organize to help push free markets and advance economic freedom. And boy, if we ever were at the right place at the right time to be talking about this issue, ESG, I couldn't have planned it better. I want to start by saying Treasurer Ellsworth has been one of our fighters this last year. We have had over a dozen comment letters to the federal regulatory agencies. As Senator Crapo was mentioning, we're getting ready to send one to the SEC. We've had several go to the Department of Labor, to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the MSRB, FINRA, the FDIC, you name it. This is a systemic attack on all of our federal financial regulatory agencies. And frankly, it's been like playing whack-a-mole this spring with a new one popping up almost every single week this year. We think that ESG really has kind of a more simplistic definition in that it's the left's attempt to pass anything that they want by circumventing the democratic process. It started off in the name of environmental global climate change. But just last week, we saw a proposal in front of three major corporations, Walmart, Lowe's, and TJ Maxx, initiating a rule proposal to support reproductive rights in the name of ESG. So I think this is where the left is going to go. You're going to hear more and more of that kind of talk, where they're going to introduce these various ideas and issues into this ESG mix. I also want to just say thank you to Representative Dixon and Senator Vick. This sausage making process can be convoluted. And so I just want to say thank you for your service to the state of Idaho. Idaho has become kind of a secondary state for me. I love Coeur d'Alene. I love the Boise, Treasure Valley area. So I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there today. But I also want to do a quick shout out to Treasurer Oaks. Treasurer Oaks has been with us for a very short time, having just been appointed to his office last summer. But I can tell you that it's not often that someone who has been as successful as Treasurer Oaks as a fund manager decides to actually run for state treasurer or become state treasurer. And Treasurer Oaks has been a welcome addition to our team. He's led this effort against the S&P Global Ratings on their arbitrary ESG rating. We like to just call it a flat out, it's a political rating. And then, of course, again, kudos to the entire state of Idaho's federal delegation and constitutional officers that joined in the pushback against that fight as well. I do want to point out, I think the future of this issue is going to become more of a legal one. We just saw Kentucky Treasurer Allison Ball send a letter to her Attorney General asking for a legal opinion on whether or not this whole idea of what Larry Fink at BlackRock calls stakeholder capitalism can be a legitimate factor in a fiduciary's responsibility in making investment decisions. Of course, that legal opinion came back as a very bold-faced no, that it cannot and should not be used. And that's what this movement continues to try to do, is interject all of these other issues in fiduciary responsibility. So I want to again thank you, Treasurer Ellsworth. Again, you've been a champion of fighting back and fighting up for the people. Idahoans are in very good hands with her at the helm of your finances. And thank you for the time. And I'm just honored to be here.
Thank you, Derek. We appreciate your description of State Financial Officers Foundation. So I want to give just a brief preview of how Marlo and I met, right? So I was involved in State Financial Officers Foundation, and we hadn't really engaged on policy. And last July, we decided, you know what, we want to engage on policy. And that was Marlo's first meeting in this group. And we were just talking back and forth and saying all these issues that we're getting involved in. And you know, he didn't miss a step. He's just involved with us. And the most significant thing I see happening with ESG is that traditionally you have your stocks that you're invested in, and who do you look out for? What's your fiduciary duty? It's to the shareholder, correct? But now, just in a very simplistic form, what ESG is trying to say is that, well, we have stakeholders who should be involved too. And stakeholders are not shareholders. Stakeholders are activists, people that, feel like they have a stake in this. Why should you be involved in something that people have a financial interest in? And as we start to see a blur in those two roles, it will become more problematic. I would like to see shareholder capitalism. But I will now introduce Marlo. Marlo Oaks was appointed Utah's 26th state treasurer on June 2021. Marlo spent 17 years overseeing multi-billion-dollar investment portfolios and is the only state treasurer with institutional investment management experience. His experience is just something we glean so much from. Marlo completed a bachelor's degree in economics from BYU, an MBA from UCLA Anderson, and holds the CFA and CAIA investment designations. He is an outspoken critic of ESG, and I will turn the time over to you, Marlo.
Thank you, Treasurer Ellis. It's a pleasure to Ellsworth, pleasure to be here in Idaho and to have the opportunity to join Vivek and Senator Crapo and Derek Kreifels and others on this panel. So just as we think about ESG, I talked about it as a political rating because at the end of the day, there are two very important subjectivity areas. One is who's deciding what the ESG factors are and who's determining what the correct answer is to those ESG factors. And as we think about the E part of ESG, we're told that unless we deal with climate change, then we're going to lose the globe, right? We're all going to die because climate is an existential threat. What we don't hear about is what is the cost of going down the path that we're being led down. What is the cost of getting rid of traditional energy? Nobody's talking about that. But if you think about the cost of that, that is a very significant cost. Think about living an 1800s Amish lifestyle. That's what we're talking about. Do we have enough cotton and wool to replace the petroleum in our clothing? Have you ever worn wool underwear in the middle of July? I mean, let's get honest here and let's get real, right? How about plastics in hospitals, right? The delivery of so much of our life-saving hospital apparatus is plastic. To say nothing of fossil fuel, natural gas as an important ingredient in creating fertilizers. So we're talking about food issues here. If we get rid of traditional energy, it impacts so many areas of our life. And having affordable, reliable, and plentiful traditional energy is the backbone of prosperous society. And yet here we are talking about getting rid of it. And let me give you an example in the state of Utah. So a few weeks ago, I received a phone call alerting me that one of our power companies had received a phone call from an insurance company that said, we are no longer going to underwrite the automobile insurance for your power company. And they said, okay, why is that? Well, because it's coal-based power. So automobile insurance now being taken away, or at least the insurance company saying we're no longer going to participate in the industry, or at least providing insurance to you because you have the wrong kind of power. The insurance entity that provides the insurance so that the power company can actually produce power received a similar call from their insurance provider. We're talking about implementing economic sanctions. European and U.S. businesses implementing economic sanctions to drive a political agenda. And where does this end? It's very easy to see that if we don't, you and I, at some point in the not too distant future, if we don't have the right profile, if we're not acting appropriately, if we're driving the wrong car or whatever it is, we may be denied services as well. This is what I call the weaponization, the politicization and the weaponization of capital. And this is what we have to stop. And I believe it's an American issue. It transcends politics. If you care about America, if you care about our constitutional form of government and free market capitalism, you will be against ESG. That's what I wanted to say.
Do you want to say some more? No.
I'm happy to say I could go on for hours.
I know. I've spent some time with you. Let's see. Give us some more input on, just your impression of, as you've been involved in the State Financial Officers Foundation, of what your impression of what effect or impact we're having on the issue and where we can go with it.
Yeah, so I think it's critical that the states stand up and provide cover for our businesses. Businesses find themselves in a very tricky place because there's such strong momentum for ESG that if you don't provide ESG in some level, then you may be canceled, right? Or you could lose business. So I think the states and the State Financial Officers Foundation is a very important organization to begin kind of this pushback, and that was my goal with the S&P letter that we put together in the state of Utah, was to stand up and say we believe that this is highly inappropriate. It further politicizes our capital markets, what S&P Global is doing, and we do not want an ESG rating on the state of Utah because it can impact the level at which we borrow capital in the capital markets. Even if you have, and I've told people this for months, in the state of Utah, we have the best credit rating in the world because we're
But Idaho is
AAA
pretty close to that.
Yeah, well,
we have AAA now.
So we, I don't doubt that, especially because you're the treasurer. But that may not matter if we have an ESG rating, because investors can then look at the ESG rating and say, well, yeah, Utah has, a AAA rating, but maybe their gun laws are too lax, or maybe they're extracting too much oil, or choose the issue, whatever it is. And to Vivek's point, right, the lack or the ambiguity in the factors is a feature of ESG. It's not a bug, right? And so you can just throw whatever you want in there. And it really is, the point is to drive behavior, the wanted behavior of the left. You can use ESG as a way to get what you want, so that states lose their self-determination and ability to basically control their own outcome.
Right. So when you hear me say that it's an undemocratic process, I believe that those decisions should be made in Congress and in legislative branches, not through coercion in some financial institution. ESG, environmental, is the E, social is the S, and G is the governance structure. So since when do you get to second guess the governance structure laid out in our Constitution? There are entities that dictate our governance structure, and it's not a run-of-the-mill type idea that you can just pull out of the hat. Marlo and I both had our states sign on to the S&P letter, and just so that you know, Standard & Poor's, they rate states. They've been authorized to do that through the federal government with an actual charge to do this. So their rating is a creation of the people. And we have always had an ESG factors baked into the rating analysis, meaning, yes, we need to know if you're subject to hurricanes. We need to know your risk factors. That has always been baked into the credit ratings of the states. But what this thing that we're pushing out against is they now want to cherry pick these certain ESG components and take them over to the side and say, look, here's another report card of where they are on this. And I say no to that. Why don't you let me cherry pick that we pay off our bonds early and put that in a side report card and say, what do you think of that? This is how wrong it is to cherry pick those issues and suddenly make it a deciding factor on credit worthiness. This is why we strongly opposed it, both our states. We hope to see that others will join us, and those are the kind of things Marlo and I keep doing.
Yeah. So here's my favorite part of one of the social issues that S&P, outlined could be a factor in an ESG rating. Adverse publicity that results in reputation risk. Now, any of you who are familiar with the state of Utah knows that the state of Utah has been dealing with reputation risks from the very beginning of our founding. We had a bunch of polygamists get together and decide they wanted to form a state, right? So we've always had reputation risk. And now we're going to suddenly leave it up to mainstream media, adverse publicity. Mainstream media is now going to be able to dictate or potentially impact our borrowing costs, because they could write about a reputational risk from the state of Utah.
And they're going to put it on a side report card to pull it out of the analysis and really highlight it. And yeah, it is unacceptable.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. To that point, in the back, I do have a handout for you all in this room. I want to direct your attention to it. It's we put it together. What are Idaho's leaders doing on ESG? And that you can go to the state treasurer's website, sto.idaho.gov. It's on this handout. And there's a red button on there, and you can click on it and get all these hot links to where you can click on. But I want to read you what we have. We have a coalition in Idaho going on here. But just last week, joint governors commented on an SEC proposed rule compelling publicly traded companies to discuss climate change in their portfolios. Our governor signed on to that letter. That's one of our leaders pushing back against ESG. We are creating a record. And I will keep it updated on my website. We signed on to the ESG, the proposed ESG rule leaves small farms in a lurch. Our Senator Russ Fulcher signed on to push back against that, took it right on the head, and there is some proposed legislation now to address, that effort. On May 18th, we had our Idaho officials. So we had the governor, the attorney general, treasurer, controller, and we are the financial people in the state, and Senator Crapo, Senator Risch, Representative Simpson, Representative Fulcher, and our President Pro Tem and Speaker. All of us signed on to push it back against S&P making this special little report card on the side, picking out all the things that might make us look good, or they might make us look not creditworthy. The whole point is it shouldn't be done. On the 16th, we, myself and the Attorney General signed on to retirement savings risk factor push. I mean, it's just another thing. You can click onto this to have all those hot links. On March 8th, the Attorney General and I signed on to a letter about municipal securities. Just another attempt to get some type of rulemaking in so that it becomes a fate that you're going to have to deal with ESG. You're going to have to implement the ESG standards. On February 14th, I joined the Attorney General, and also we signed on to the comptroller of the currency. What were they doing on that? Yeah, they were trying to, the comptroller of the currency was trying to implement climate-related financial risk management through the currency. That was in February. This list just keeps giving. And I only took it back to December, and that's when we, the Attorney General, are pushed back against the Department of Labor and their proposed rules to implement this in the savings. Would you even have imagined that there's that many efforts within the regulatory arm of the nation trying to get this undemocratic agenda through a financial institution? I feel strongly that we will keep tracking it. This is what Marlo and I do. Marlo has great insight on the details and the significance and why, if you're moving through the SEC for a certain rule change, how that will ultimately impact so many more things. I do not believe this helps my constituents. And I am very grateful for the great efforts we have and the people around us that have been helping out. And to that point, I do have two co-chairs here. We have Senator Vick and Representative Sage Dixon, and they are co-chairs of the Federalism Committee. I first brought my concern to the Federalism Committee about the IRS overreach, where they wanted to go into anybody that did $600 or, that deal. Everybody's going, yeah. Okay, that was my first. And then we realized that, that the financial regulatory process has expressly been saying that they are going to implement these environmental Green New Deal type things through the Treasury. So I've started to interact with these two co-chairs a lot because I want to keep the state of Idaho up to date on what is happening. And I sure appreciate what they've done and allowing me to have a segue to the leadership in the state of Idaho and our Idaho legislature. And I'm going to yield some time to them so that you could perhaps describe our Senate Bill 1405 and what happened in the legislature and what you see is going to happen in the future. And I'll go to you first, Senator Vick.
Thank you, Treasurer Ellsworth. So first of all, I want to talk about why I have a concern with ESG. And those that are proponents of ESG say, well, it's just another way to let the market decide where we go on these issues. And I think it's just the opposite. I think that they decided that they weren't happy with the progress they made. And as Vivek said, it was what they call socially responsible investing. They were trying to use the market. And the investors were really more concerned about the return on their investment than these social issues. So they weren't making the progress they wanted to make. And so now they're going to try to force us to accept their agenda. And so that's where my concern with this started. And I think that having tried to always champion individual rights in my time in the legislature, I saw this as taking away individuals' rights, whether that's to make investments of their choice or participate through changes in the democratic process. And so my frustration started there. And so when we discussed some legislation, we had several proposals that came forward, but the one that ended up passing was the one we worked with the treasurer on, to help our investment boards, the treasurer and the other investment boards, to have a legal backing to say, no, we're going to invest on being a prudent investor, not on these issues. And it received strong support in the legislature and was signed by the governor. But that's, I think, if my money is in the state retirement system, and some of it is, I want that money to be invested to get the best return, not only to keep that, primarily to keep that system solvent, but secondarily so that I make sure that the retirement that I'm owed, I can keep. And I think that's where most people are in our society, regardless of their politics, is they want to see investments made in a prudent way. So that was the legislation we passed, and that's a very simple summary of what it does. But
Thank you, Senator Vick. And you hit right on the part that you're a shareholder in that situation, and now ESG is kind of pushing in stakeholders, people, activists into, and it's your money that's being invested. Why don't you get to say how it's invested? That's the basic point of what we see in overreach. And so, Representative Sage, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you, Treasurer Ellsworth. Thank you for having us be a part of this panel. Thank you, everybody who's spoken. I think a lot of things that could be said, I don't want to reiterate in doing that as far as our motivations and the difficulties we see coming forward in doing this. So a lot of my motivation started with the constituent, actually, that brought this to me early last session. I started to develop legislation looking into that, and then another couple representatives, Representative Ehart and DeMordaunt, brought their version of it because they had been interested as well in bringing to it. So the House started early last year, earlier this year, trying to develop something to protect not just Idaho industry, but also Idaho citizens, because of the fear where this may go that Treasurer Oaks alluded to, that this could very well trickle down to individuals, that this may be some sort of a social credit score that we see going on in other nations, but primarily that this is now a tool to force a political compliance into an area that would not have been achieved legislatively. And what really sprung to my mind, I was at a meeting in Salt Lake City with a lot of other state legislators, and I was speaking with a state legislator from Utah and some from Wyoming and Arkansas, and President Biden said that we know we can't achieve these things legislatively, so we're going to use the power of procurement, the United States being the largest procurer of goods in the world, to force the changes that we want to change. And as then this ESG conversation started developing, there's a serious threat in doing that. And the notion that if we do establish some different legislation or somehow injecting government into the free market or private industry, as Vivek said, there's three main groups that are already controlling that. That private market is not a yard, say, it's down to maybe 6 inches, or free market in that sense, because the people that control the capital and influence other people, as Treasurer Oaks said also with the insurance companies, are controlling the outcome they want to have at that point. And that is abridging our legislative process. That's something that we as legislators need to stand up and protect against for our citizens in Idaho and Utah, but also in our federal delegation as well. Happy to see that this is coming together, that our state constitutional officers are coming out against this and doing that. Worked very well with Treasurer Ellsworth. Very thankful for that. That was somewhat of a revelation as we were starting to go through this, that she was there with us doing her own work, and that the state financial officers are doing this. So that gives a much larger push push in trying to change these things or install protections for the citizens of Idaho in doing that and across the country. If all these state federal financial officers are pushing back and saying we're not going to follow this, not going to invest in companies that are pushing this or institutions that are, that can help affect some change. But issues like this and what we've heard about regulatory agencies pushing agendas is exactly why we need the Committee on Federalism, to say this is not in your purview. This is why we need to stand up. We as legislators need to stand up for our citizens to look into these things. Maybe it is within the purview of the federal government in a sense of doing it, but primarily it's not, with executive orders and regulatory agencies making rules that then we have to abide by as if it were law, but it's not law made by people elected by the citizens of Idaho or any other state for that matter. So we in the House had a piece of legislation come out of the House. Well, it didn't. We had it ready. It came into committee, I'll say that, to address many different facets of what ESG touches, but it was a little convoluted. It's a difficult subject to explain to people that don't have a lot of time, being my colleagues, other legislators, and then also to get into the nitty-gritty of it. We had to hold that bill, unfortunately, and I was thankful that in working with Senator Vick and Treasurer Ellsworth, we were able to come up with 1405 that we did to start that process, to get it out there, the protection that we want to do. We did pass a resolution in the House, which was House Resolution 52, that said we want to explore this further. We want to look into this. It directed the Committee on Federalism to hold hearings this year and prepare legislation going forward next year so that we can have something ready to go next year for the body to look at, working with all the stakeholders. We know there's a lot of concern with the financial institutions. Don't want to harm them at all. This is about a protection. We don't want to make something more difficult in areas that already are heavily regulated in doing that, but it's about protection going forward. So I will say confidently, should I be here in January, that's something that this Committee on Federalism will continue to hold hearings before the new year in doing that and develop some legislation, try and have a firmer grip, something that we can present to our colleagues that can be moved forward come the new year. So if we go in the future, as you said, Treasurer, that's something we're looking at doing and working with you as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Dixon. I always call him Representative Sage, and I call him Vic. I don't know why. No title for Senator Vic there. Okay, so I wanted to tell you that this letter that I encourage you to pick up is our letter. You know, it's the one that shows what we're doing in Idaho. Every time I go in front of the Federalism Committee in Idaho, this is going to be the update. But the neat thing about this letter that's available to all of you back there is that it will be updated, and it represents action, and it represents groups of people involved, groups of people tracking the detrimental nature of ESG. On the second page of this document that we have back there is a guest opinion that I wrote for our local media. And if you need concrete examples of ESG, I have outlined 3 of them within that guest opinion. You don't need to assume things will happen. You don't need to make up, fairy tale ideas. These are actual things that are happening because of ESG and standards that are being forced on industry. So I thank you for this opportunity to use your time today to kind of give you just the general worldview of ESG. Of course, we have Vivek who deals with it on the market, and we had Senator Crapo who is dealing with it in all different facets. As treasurers, we're engaging to push back on types of regulatory processes that would force a bank in our state to implement ESG. To the extent you're being forced to do this, let us know, because if it's a regulatory issue, we can push back on that. We can keep record of it. This is not acceptable to force this type of behavior. And then, of course, we take it to our legislative area with our co-chairs here. I think it's a beautiful mix of people in the right positions that can make a difference. And I thank you for your time for this meeting today. I'll adjourn the meeting, and then in a few minutes within this same room, our co-chairs will convene their Federalism Committee meeting, and they'll talk about similar issues. But thank you for your time and your attendance. Thanks.
And
Am I okay?
I think this is off.